All right. Well, thank you, Tracy, for doing the MC duties, and thank you, Elizabeth, on my team for getting this set up and going. I hope everybody is doing fine today. We really pulled this together quickly, so I appreciate everybody being able to make the time slot. I really wanted to support our monthly webinar schedule that was created by the Utah Main Street program last year under Go Utah. And so I just thought this was a great way for us to introduce ourselves from the State Historic Preservation Office, go through some of the programmatic updates. And also, if you guys have any questions for us, please let us know, because this is obviously, some of you have heard me say this is a fire hose that I'm now drinking out of. And I have some great partners that are helping me, just defray that water hose, but I'm still learning a lot. And I want to make sure that we're doing everything right by the community. So I appreciate everybody joining today. I sent an agenda in the email. And so I thought, the first thing we're going to do is talk about what is the SHPO, what is our office, what are our mandates. I have a sort of canned slideshow that as I go through our different program areas, I'm going to pitch it to the relevant staff that have joined us today. And at that point, I'd ask them to turn their camera on, unmute, introduce themselves, give a little bit of their history, their background, and how they interact with the Main Street program. Once we get through that, we're going to talk about the staffing, how we're going to make sure to support the Main Street program going forward. Then move to, I know some of you have questions on new community applications and that process. So I want to touch on sort of my thinking on that. Maybe also seeing that we have such an active chat going, looking for future webinar topics that the communities feel that it's something that they would like some more in depth. So August, we have the Office of Tourism, Bianca here. They're going to take the August webinar, and I've asked Tracy to help facilitate a September workshop or webinar on murals, given some feedback that we received from Roger Roper. And so think about future webinar topics. I also want to update, many of you emailed in response to the grad student opportunities, the University of Utah's planning department. I want to talk through that, where we're at with that process. And then finally talk about the advisory committee and some of the vacancies that we have there with this transition. So a lot for us to cover in this hour. So I appreciate everybody's participations and patience. This is being recorded as well, so we'll all watch our language. Probably most of me included, but that allows us to share that with the other communities who are unable to join us today. So starting at the top of the agenda, what is a SHPO? So with the legislation of the last legislative cycle, the Utah Main Street program was moved from Go Utah, the old governor's Office of Economic Development, to the Department of Cultural and Community Engagement, which is just another department within state government. Underneath that department, there are many divisions. Tracy and Jason Bowcut's Division of Arts and Museums. We have USERV, which is a volunteerism, Division of Indian Affairs, Multicultural Affairs, State Library. We also acquired the Pete Suazo Boxing Commission in the last legislative cycle. And state history, of course. So we have quite a few other divisions that live within the Department of CCE. We are one office underneath that umbrella. For the last 40 years, we were part of the Division of State History, but in the same legislative cycle, we were separated out and created into our own office. There was no malfeasance here. It was just a good, effective split, seeing that the Division of State History is actually going to be the party that is going to be running the new Museum of Utah up on the Capitol grounds. And so it allows both of our offices to focus on our mission and mandate. So the SHPO is now standalone. I have 17 full-time employees that work in the SHPO. And the SHPO is actually a nationwide office. So if you go all the way back to 1966, some of you lived that long ago, the federal government passed the National Historic Preservation Act, which was the first federal legislation to mandate that the federal government take into account their actions on historic or archaeological resources. This is really a response to the 1950s and early 60s urban renewal and the interstate program that destroyed a lot of our historic downtowns without really any planning and participation from the public, and sadly, without a lot of even voice from the state. Part of that Historic Preservation Act was to give each state an office that would live within state government, that the officer, which is me, Chris Merritt, which is a title bestowed by the governor to orchestrate these programs. And so the SHPO in Utah started in the early 1970s, so a few years after passage of the Historic Preservation Act, and has been operating that way since. We are tasked with many different programs that are federally mandated, which we're going to highlight those today. But we've also, over the years, have taken on state mandated programs, and we're going to highlight a couple of those as well. And so every state and territory has a SHPO office, State Historic Preservation Office. I use the shorthand SHPO. Some states say SHPO, which is a very interesting way to enunciate that. But every state has an office like ours. I'm a state employee. All my staff are state employees, but we interact directly with the federal government, and our funding is 60% federal. That comes from the National Park Service and the Historic Preservation Fund, which thankfully, in the last federal legislative cycle, we actually are getting a good appropriation finally and starting to bring up after a lot of years of static budgeting. So my job is 60% federal, 40% state match. Now, how that translates is we have some programs that we actually have to pass through funds to local governments, which we'll talk about that. But all of this is to promote a local voice in preservation. And we do it through many different varieties of program. And due to our recent split from state history, that is our brand new shiny logo that just got approved about 2 weeks ago. And so we're happy to show that off. Everyone asks, like, what's it supposed to mean? I'm just going to do the Rorschach test to you. I just like it because I like the colors and I like the simplicity, but it is supposed to be reminiscent of roof lines and mountains and sort of a whole host of things that we do as an office. Myself, I'm an archaeologist. I received my PhD from the University of Montana back in 2010, where I studied the overseas Chinese history and archaeology up there in Montana. Came down to Utah in 2010 after graduation, worked private sector, worked for the National Forest Service, and then started working for the SHPO in December of 2012. I'm a historical archaeologist, but since 2012, I've sort of moved up the ladder and organized the SHPO into a nice cohesive little operation. I have some amazing team members that make sure that I don't look like a moron most days, which is always appreciated. And so I'm coming at this from an archaeological perspective, but as a historic archaeologist, I love all facets of history equally. It's all a fascinating piece, whether it's a built environment downtown or a 13,000-year-old fire hearth out in the West Desert. It's all really cool because it is all part of what makes Utah, Utah. Our office is normally at the Rio Grande Depot in downtown Salt Lake City. We are currently being housed on an office building on Highland Drive, about 3700 south in Mill Creek, due to extensive earthquake damage that the Rio Grande suffered in March of 2020 during our little shaker. This building has been the office's home and state history's home since 1979. And it's a nice 1911 train depot that is just beautiful. And the state is investing millions of dollars to repair the earthquake damage, but also to stabilize it. So we're going to be in the Highland building at least for the next couple of years while they finish that work. This is also the place that all the state's historic artifacts were collected. So photographs, manuscripts, and objects of history were in this building. Those are the items that are going to be going to our new museum up on the Capitol grounds. And so hopefully by 2024, we will be back at the Rio Grande Depot, which I personally feel is a great symbol of historic preservation in the state. It's a very iconic building, and I'm very excited to move back to that location. So we have a lot of programs, and this is the run through, and then I'm going to pitch to the staff on individual slides for their programs. But Some of these come from the federal government. The Certified Local Government Program, which we work with local municipalities, cities and counties to create a local government we can pass grants to. That's a federal mandated program because the federal government saw it as a need. Like, well, for supporting the state's preservation program, we need to find a way to support the local community's preservation program. The National Register of Historic Places, you've all seen these plaques on historic buildings. Our office manages that program. Tax credits, we already had Todd, who's on the phone call, mentioned that he's taken advantage of tax credits himself. And we manage 2 programs, and I'll pitch it to that coordinator here in a minute. We also provide technical assistance. Some of you knew Don Hartley. He used to be our old preservation architect since the 1980s. He retired a few years ago. We had Steve Cornell, who now works for FFKR. He was our architect for a little over a year. And now we have a shiny new one, Jansen Bennett, who will last longer than Steve because we will not let him leave. He's on probation and work release from the prison, so I can't let him actually leave. That's a joke. Jansen's a great resource, and I'm going to have him introduce himself because he's already been working with some of you community members, but it's good to know that we have a licensed architect on staff that is trained in how to deal specifically with historic buildings. We also manage all the archaeological and historic records for the state. So if you're a community that doesn't even know what you have, reach out to us. We have an online viewer that you can see all these historic buildings. You can search through their eligibility. We try to sponsor surveys to get more information for local communities to see what you have and what you don't have and how we can better manage and help you support those. So we are the center for this information for the state. Right now, we have about 130,000 buildings in our database and another 115,000 archaeological sites in our databases. And those range from 13,000-year-old Paleo-Indian hunting sites on Hill Air Force Base, all the way to 1950s and 60s Cold War era uranium mining sites. It's all interesting and all part of our databases. That is also a federal mandate with some state mandates. We do a lot of outreach and education, and we try to tailor our programs now to be very outward focused. And so we've actually been able to bring on a public archaeologist using a retirement, and I'll have her introduce herself here in a minute. But we're trying to figure out new ways to train, new ways to educate, because there's a big gap in what people know they can do with archaeology and historic buildings and what they can really do and what the middle part can actually cause damage. This isn't the sexiest part of our job, but it is a very important part, is that I have staff who aren't joining us today that review all work coming in from state and federal agencies. So every time you see a road UDOT project that's road widening, our office has reviewed the impacts to cultural resources, FCC towers, cell phone towers. So we review all those projects and provide comments. And then finally, we have the Human Remains Program, which some of you might not even know that exists, but the state does have, and I'll talk about it later, a way if human remains are found on non-state or federal lands on how to deal with those ancient human remains, meaning Native American human remains. So that's a brief overview of all of our program updates. The photo on the left is just, I'm a nerding out. That's a wooden salt water flume that pumped water out of Great Salt Lake to the big evaporation ponds on the south shore of Great Salt Lake. So that was installed in the 1880s and still there. It's a big barrel pipe. So sorry, nerded out on that one. So the laws I'm going to take first because I'm not asking those staff to participate. There's a federal law. So if a community is taking federal money or permits, like an Army Corps permit, there are laws that apply. Same as the Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service, these federal agencies have to comply with laws protecting cultural resources. Now, that doesn't mean that the law can stop projects. Neither the federal or state one can stop projects. It merely is folding cultural resources into the planning process. And I'm always proud to say that the Historic Preservation Act of 1966 is 3 years before NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. So they cared more about archaeology than bugs and bunnies back in the day. So I feel good about that. But those laws are in place to make sure the agency is accounting for that. And some of our communities that are on the phone right now, you've interacted with federal government, you've worked with UDOT on projects and trying to balance the needs of progress and preservation. That's what these laws are here for. We're one of about 30 states that has a state law equivalent. So this means state agencies like SITLA, School Trust Lands, Wildlife Resources, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, they also have to take into their actions into account, even though there's no federal hook. And so we work closely with our state partners to ensure they're doing those processes as well. And then our process, our role in the process is to provide advice, assistance. We're not regulatory. I can't say no to projects as much as people always want me to. I always joke we get 2 phone calls. People that want me to block a project, or our office to block a project, or our office that thinks we're overreaching and will block a project. So we sit in the nice neutral place of like, I just provide comment. You guys do what you need to do with the agencies. But that's an overview of the laws. So now I'm going to pitch it over to Corey Jensen, who's our National Register Coordinator, to kind of talk about what that program is, does, and how it intersects with Main Street. So Corey, take it away, sir.
I will. So nice to see you all. As Chris said, I'm over the National Register of Historic Places program, administering sites in Utah. This is a federal program, but each state has its own National Register Coordinator to take care of the whole process of review of nominations before the nomination actually ends up in federal hands for review. I've been in this position since 1998, so I'm kind of an old timer. Roger actually hired me back then. So anyway, I've enjoyed working in the office and with the staff over a couple of decades now. So in Utah, we have over 1,400 individually listed properties. These are properties that were nominated separately by themselves, and they include everything from buildings to bridges, site markers, anything, and then of course archaeological sites. So people mostly think of buildings as being on the National Register, but it entails several different types of objects, structures, buildings, that kind of thing. And then if you include the 70 plus historic districts we have in the state, there are close to 20,000 properties or more that are in the National Register of Historic Places in Utah. And so I often get asked, why would I want to list my property on the National Register? Mostly we like to see properties listed to encourage historic preservation and to recognize our history. They are our most tangible assets out there for our history. People see them every day as they're driving along the streets, walking along the sidewalks. So by preserving these, which is the other reason we like to see these properties listed, is that it encourages preservation. We can see our history and helps us feel a sense of community and a sense of belonging to our past. There are, however, some incentives that come with listing. Most of the time, people think that there's some kind of restriction that comes with listing on the National Register, and there isn't. It's completely honorific designation, but it does offer incentives to preserve the building. And one of those is the tax credits available for those who own a historic building and would like to preserve, maintain, restore it. There are certain types of tax credits available to do that, and that drives a lot of the nominations in the state. And then also compliance, as Chris was discussing, compliance with the state. Federal and state agencies are required to note the undertakings on their property, and they're supposed to recognize historic properties on their land. And part of the federal code is that they nominate those to the National Register. That doesn't always happen, but we like to see it happen. So anyway, that's kind of a quick overview of the National Register in Utah.
Thank you, Corey, for that. And those communities that you don't know what you have, you don't know if you have a historic district, or you're interested in doing that, please reach out to Corey. He not only is our National Register Coordinator, but he's also, with Roger's recent retirement, the master and commander of our database, and knows that in and out. So he can help you and also helps with our survey programs as well. So thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
All right. Next, our Certified Local Government Program. And for this one, I'm going to pitch to Alina Franco, who's our Certified Local Government Coordinator, and who probably many of you already know.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alina Franco, and I manage the Certified Local Government Grant Program. We call them CLGs for short. And this is SHPO's grant program to local governments that have been certified through the National Park Service, and again, to assist them in their historic preservation activities. And there are several communities on this webinar who are CLGs and have taken advantage of CLG grants in the past or currently. Again, when you're a CLG, there are several grant projects you can do. Such as you can, do a survey of the historic buildings in your community. You can do public education activities, feasibility studies. The most popular grant project is rehabilitation on properties that are listed on the National Register. And we do have an architect on staff who would assist with those projects. So that's, very valuable. We have many CLGs who focus their projects every year just on buildings on their main street. And stuff. So we have 99 local governments that participate in this program, and we have grant funds available every January. So this can really help your efforts in revitalizing your historic main streets. So if anyone on this webinar, if you're not sure about your status or you would like to know more information, just feel free to contact me.
Thank you, Alina. And I do like to point out that we have the second highest number of CLGs in the entire country, or at least we're tied for number one. And that goes back to the very beginning of the programs to make sure that urban areas were not privileged in access to grant funds versus rural communities. And so, again, that's another founding tenet of the office. As already been mentioned, so now we're layering programs on. So if you now want to pitch it over to Amber Anderson, who's our historic tax credit specialist, she'll walk through what this is and how it interrelates to some of the other programs you just heard about.
Hi, everyone. Amber Anderson. I've been in this position for about 4 years now. My background's in historic preservation. Alina and I both actually have degrees from the Clemson College of Charleston program in South Carolina. So I manage these two programs. There's a federal income tax credit program for income producing properties, and then the state income tax credit for residential properties. And both of these provide to approved projects a tax credit equivalent to about 20% of a rehabilitation's costs. And so if you have a situation where there is a residential rental use of a historic building where you might qualify for both federal and state, we are looking at a potential 40% income tax credit. So either 20% money back as an income tax credit or potentially 40% for a residential rental situation. And this program actually does interact with Main Street pretty closely, because a lot of historic main streets, either the entire main street itself or individual buildings, are already listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which is a requirement for the tax credit programs. Either they're already listed or they're in process of being listed. I know there's a few communities on the call, like Tooele and Brigham City, who are starting the process to have their main streets listed as historic districts. Or there are other communities that have eligible buildings and districts that would be eligible for these programs. And a building doesn't have to be listed on the National Register before you can apply for tax credits. You can start that process together. So that's important to know. But another way that the tax credit programs overlap with Main Street is that a typical building on a main street that has an upper two or one or two stories that historically were residential or offices and could be turned into residential, those buildings are prime to make use of tax credits, because the owner could potentially pursue the federal commercial tax credit for the whole building, because it just requires an income producing use, whereas the upper floors could pursue the state tax credit. So you'd be looking at 20% for the entire building federal, and then additional 20% for the upper floors to rehabilitate those into residential space. So it's a pretty good correlation between those two programs. I mentioned that the building has to be listed on the National Register in order to get tax credits, or it has to be listed at least by the time within a few years of you finishing a tax credit project in order to qualify. But that doesn't mean that it has to be individually listed. It can be a contributing property in a historic district. And honestly, if you're not sure that if you don't think a building is listed on the National Register, or you're not sure that it's eligible to be listed, I would encourage you just to reach out, because we do have people who don't who don't understand that buildings are listed because they're in historic districts. I've had people miss out on the tax credit programs before because it wasn't individually listed. So either way, I would encourage you to reach out. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was that the tax credit programs require that all work being done to the property follows what are called the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. So that's outside, inside, and anything on the site. So that's an important thing to note. It's also the reason why it's really important to reach out to us and start the application process before physically touching the building if possible. That way we can help guide the applicant to make sure they're not going to do anything that's going to end up disqualifying them. And we can make sure that they're following the right process, the right application. The two different programs have different application processes. So basically, if you think that you or someone you know might be interested in these programs, I would just highly encourage you to reach out as soon as possible. And that's all I got for you.
Okay. Thank you, Amber. And for those communities out there with economic development offices and staff, it's probably a good idea to, maybe have Amber speak to groups of folks that are maybe interested in investing in your downtowns. And so they know some of the incentives that right out the gate, because these can interlock with some of the other incentives that the state offers, like opportunity zone credits and RDA areas. Like there's a lot of ways to layer these credits to make a potentially non-pensable historic building rehab to be a very profitable historic building rehab. So feel free to reach out if you want to have anybody on my team speak to groups, but we're offering lots of opportunities for that. So thank you, Amber. Actually, before I leave this tax credit slide, because I don't have one specifically for technical assistance, I'm going to ask Jansen Bennett, our new architect, to introduce himself and how he interacts with these programs and Main Street.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jansen, and as Chris mentioned a while ago, I am a licensed architect. I got my Master of Architecture from the University of Washington in Seattle, and then I've spent my career looking at historic buildings, typically historic schools and university buildings, but I also have experience with historic homes, historic businesses, etc. So I am here primarily to assist in projects. So that can be design assistance with how to, add or alter historic buildings or structures without kind of ruining or hurting their historic character defining features. And this can range from anything from like, what color should I paint my building, to I need to kind of do a big rehabilitation or remodel to my building, or I need to add an accessible ramp to my building, and how should I design it without ruining the facade. I am also happy to provide more technical assistance. So investigating how water is getting inside, as well as how to solve water infiltration, masonry that's crumbling or otherwise damaged. And, I'm not a structural engineer, but I can advise a little bit on, sagging windows or cracking masonry, etc. So any of the kind of nuts and bolts questions I love. I can also help with any code questions, as well as finding creative solutions to code requirements. So there are typically 5 different building codes that all affect work done on historic buildings. And each of those codes have different exemptions of when a historic building doesn't need to meet the requirements, as well as what those exemptions are. And I am happy to discuss any of those questions or give a brief overview of kind of guidelines of what you may be able to do or may not be able to do to meet code. And I'm also happy to kind of discuss all of those questions, both with building owners as well as code officials, to try to find a good middle ground of how to make a project feasible and still safe and kind of meeting all of the code requirements. I also want to note that I'm happy to help with any building, regardless of whether or not it's already listed on the National Register of Historic Building or Historic Places, either as an individual building or as a contributing building within the district. So for main streets in particular, there are lots of buildings that are just outside of the 50-year-old window, but that could still use help. And I'm happy to help with any of them. So reach out to me if you have any questions at all.
Okay, thank you, Jansen. And I'm going to add this little bit of testimonial to all my building staff. Is the power of Jansen is when you have a community building owner that wants to do rehab and they've hired a structural engineer or an architectural firm, those engineers or firms probably do not have anybody on staff that knows how to deal with a historic building. And so they might be giving recommendations that are good in their mind, but not good for the preservation of the structure, just because they're limited by their own experience and knowledge. And so having, Jansen and Amber and Corey available to provide yeah, that's one solution, but here's a more appropriate solution, usually is a very productive conversation, just because it's not coming from a place of bad, it's coming from a place of a lack of knowledge. So feel free to reach out to Jansen and have those conversations. So thank you, sir. So moving quickly through this is a big slide, but this is the Ancient Human Remains Program. Those of you who are with municipalities, I guarantee you, your city or sheriff's department knows who this program is. We have 2 forensic anthropologists on our staff. They work under this mandate that if human remains are recovered on non-federal lands that are not state lands, then we actually take control of the recovery, work with Native American tribes and Division of Indian Affairs for repatriation and analysis. And all of this has a very narrow 1 to 2 day window in order to do that with no expense to the landowner. But your police departments or sheriff's department have probably had trainings from Dr. Dorina Kopp, and she gets text messages from every community of we found a bone. Somebody was digging their house and found a bone. The number of old bones under houses is actually more staggering than you would think. But this is another resource that hopefully you won't need, but does often happen. I like to mention this because a lot of developers and building contractors if you find remains, our projects are shut down forever. That's not what the law says. And we've had many anecdotal circumstances of we'll just hide it, which is actually against the law. Versus actually us having it notified, us getting the remains and working through it. So as a community leader, I just want to make you aware that if you hit human remains in your city limits or the county limits and it meets this definition of a non-federal land, have the sheriff department call, have the police department call. That's your first stop. That these are people. We want to respectfully get them out of the ground, out of the way of the project, and work with the tribes to find a better solution. And as you can see by this map, we've had human remains discoveries everywhere, and most of them are coming from home construction. So obviously in developed areas, municipalities. So everybody's had those remains pop up. We're here as a resource to solve that. Sort of my last slide is sort of our archaeological public outreach, which is really morphed into our entire Shippo program's public outreach program. And so I would like Elizabeth Hora, who's one of our co-hosts today on my team, kind of introduce herself and how our outreach efforts are going statewide and how perhaps you could be interested beyond Main Street.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Elizabeth Hora. I am an archaeologist, and I hear what you're saying. Been 38 minutes. This has been really exciting, really interesting, really pertinent to what I do for my life. But now I want to get really esoteric and really weird. That's where I come in. Hello. So this is archaeology. We have 13,000 years of human history here in the state of Utah. And much of it is under your feet right now. As Chris mentioned, if you are in one of the major cities along the Wasatch Front, you are in St. George, if you are in Price or Cedar City, any of our major cities, I guarantee you that someone has been here before for the last 13,000 years, people have walked across this land. They have hunted on this land. They have lived on this land. They have built cities and towns on this land. It's something that we, in our built environment now, don't interact with a ton. But if you know what you're looking for, you see an awful lot out there. And so the Public Archaeology Network, and what I do here with Public Archaeology, is I help people to understand what's out there and what important information they can take away and adapt into their own lives. We're talking so much these days about the Great Salt Lake shrinking. What do we do when the Great Salt Lake gets low? Well, we can turn to history and say, what did people used to do when the Great Salt Lake gets really low? How did they, how did they adapt? What environmental changes did they see occur as sort of downstream effects from something like the lake shrinking? We've got some really great records that can indicate that. And then as far as, in your communities now, you probably have prehistoric, ancient, historic items, or whether that be artifacts or features or whole sites embedded in your communities. And we have a cultural site stewardship program where we train people to go out and monitor these resources and care for them. So, for example, here in Salt Lake, you guys are probably familiar with Gilgal Gardens. This is a stretch for us, but we're moving into this area of stewarding more community cultural resources. So Gilgal Gardens was created by, I completely forget the name of the stonemason, I apologize, or the sculptor, but he made these incredible and very bizarre religiously inspired sculptures, and he has an entire garden that was adjacent to his house dedicated to it. There's a Friends of Gilgal Gardens organization that maintains these places, but we also have been working with them and working with the city, who technically owns the property, to make sure that we have someone from our staff go out there, take some repeat photographs, take some notes about, any new damage, what kind of visitation it's getting. And that helps the city manage this property, and it helps the Friends group manage this property. So we work with every major land managing agency that's operating in the state, whether that be the School Institutional Trust Lands Administration or the Bureau of Land Management, the National Forest Service, all these good folks. We've got, 600 plus sites in the program. We have nearly 300 stewards operating on those grounds. So if that's something that your community or your organization would like to get involved with more deeply, please reach out to me or to Chris, and we'll make sure that we've got, we make good connections with you, and we find ways that we can help. And then also, if you just want to know anything about archaeology, definitely follow us on social media, find our website. Those websites will be changing in the next few weeks as we transition. But I'm just really excited to be here, really excited to be your total curveball in this awesome group of folks. Thanks for giving me a minute.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. And I also want to put a shout out to some of our gateway communities that are on here, like Price. That Elizabeth's been able to work very closely with the Office of Tourism. Thank you, Bianca, to come up with great messaging of how to respectfully visit these places. And so as a gateway community, we're always looking for creative ways to partner to get that messaging into places that you feel the visitors are using, and to find a way to make sure that we're working with you collaboratively. So a lot of people don't realize the proper way to visit an archaeological site. And so Elizabeth is here to help guide that. And we have really colorful swag and cool stuff. So thank you, Elizabeth, for that. So that kind of goes through the SHPO staff introductions of folks that are on here. Here are the contact information for everyone that you heard from today, plus some additional folks. I'm happy to share this out to the registrant list too, this whole PowerPoint, just so you can have a reference to this. And so I don't want to cut anybody's questions if you had any for specific staff, but I do want to quickly move through some of these updates so we can have a little bit of time at the end for any Q&A. And if you do have questions for specific staff, feel free to drop it in the chat. I see them already answering questions, so appreciate everybody's patience in minute 42 of this webinar. So the very first one for a program update is the very last line. So on July 1st, Roger Roper, who's joining our webinar today, so thank you, Roger, for continuing to play in the Main Street pond, he retired. And he, as all of you know, he's been instrumental in the Utah Main Street program, both this time and the previous time that a run was made at the program. And what we're going to do as an office, that when the program came to us from Go Utah, it did not come with a staff position. So Roger's retirement is timely in the sense that we can now reposition his vacancy into a full-time permanent Main Street coordinator whose 80 to 90% of duties will be focused on being the statewide coordinator. So I will probably not be leading meetings like this forever. Once we get this person hired and going, Paul Larson and Jared Stewart both volunteered to work on my hiring committee as we get moving on that. With some hiring issues with the state, we're going to probably not advertise this position to mid-July, and I will send it to the Main Street list. It will be a full-time benefited state position. We're, like every other industry, we're struggling to find qualified candidates because the state doesn't pay, as well as the private sector. And right now it's kind of a buyer's market or seller's market, and that the employee can really pick and choose what they want. But I would love for you to share that job announcement far and wide with your networks. My hope is to do a fairly escalated hiring process and get somebody on board by mid-August. So maybe by the time of Bianca's webinar, I'll be introducing you to a person, but it is my goal to try to get that position staffed as quickly as possible because you guys all deserve that. The other next programmatic update is new community applications. Many of you have reached out asking, hey, I'm interested. We've talked with Nan and folks about getting our community listed. And since the program is now 5 days old in my world, we're continuing to pause new community formally applying or being designated. Now, that does not mean we cannot have conversations. We cannot do a site meeting. We did actually one in June. I went down with Arts and Museums and some of my staff to visit with a community that's interested in becoming another Main Street community. So we will be doing some new community applications, but please be patient. Please be reaching out in ways that we can help you get structured so that you can have the best successful application possible. But we are probably just still not going to be doing anything at least into the fall, just to let us get our feet underneath us. As you can all imagine, starting a new program and getting our arms around it is time consuming. So I appreciate your patience there, but it is our full intention to offer that up and to expand the program. There will be questions down the road of when's enough is enough. How many communities can we effectively still give good loving to? I know some states have many, some states have few. That's something that we will work closely with the advisory committee of Main Street to work through the sweet spot. But right now, my heart and door is open for new communities. The next programmatic update is many of you received an email from me from Jordan Ketcher, who now works full-time for the University of Utah, but she offered up 3 grad students that want to do Main Street-based projects. I'm capitalizing on that, and we're actually having a meeting this afternoon at 3 with myself, Jordan, and the students to go through the 6 or 7 communities that offered some ideas on how they could use this graduate student support. And we're going to try to find good matches for the student and the project. As a professor myself, I've learned that if you force a student to do something they're really not interested in, you're not going to get a great product out the back end, except in really rare circumstances. So we want to propose these ideas, try to give them the ideas of what they can do. So when they do reach back to the community that pitched the idea, I'm not giving you a graduate student that might not do the job. But as hopes, I'm starting a programmatic discussion with the planning department to have this a regular part of a Main Street relationship, to form an MOU between us and the University of Utah's planning department to come up with graduate students potentially every semester, if not at least twice a year, to support Main Street communities. I feel that's another service we can provide from the statewide level. So each of the communities doesn't have to create their own relationship, which I support if you want to do that, but let us take this task. So these first 3 are our 4A, but I hope to have 3 every year or 3 every semester even, and make sure we're getting a lot of interesting student research. And then these are future employees for both you and us that know a little bit about Main Street. So I will circle back to you after our discussion this afternoon with the graduate students. Let's see, the last update, and then I want to circle to ideas for future webinars, and I'm staying mostly on time, is we do have a bunch of vacancies on the advisory committee. So like all state government, a program has a board associated with it to help guide it, to help policies and procedures. We have our attorney that represents Main Street on this call today, Todd Jensen. So everybody, he's a very nice attorney. He's not the classic joke attorney. So I appreciated his help in the advisory committee last week, a couple weeks ago. But we will have vacancies. Well, Roger's spot on Shippo will be vacant. We do have a vacancy out of Go Utah, so the Community and Economic Development Division. And then I do know, and I don't know if we want to make it very public, but I do know there's another vacancy coming from a position that's filling as like a external interested party slot. So we're going to have to be filling potentially 3 vacancies plus the coordinator, which will be the Main Street coordinator. So the advisory committee is a bit short strung right now, but I will be sending out emails to get ideas of who we could approach to be added to the advisory committee. And my hope is to make this advisory committee very robust and ask them to do the mentorship of other communities that maybe don't have the same access to the coordinator, and try to make my one coordinator a team of 12 coordinators to help bring questions and answers and resources to local communities, whether they're in the program or looking to join the program. And then, so be looking out for that. The next meeting for the advisory committee isn't till October, I think. It's a quarterly meeting, so we're going to have to fill that soon. All right. That's a lot. Thanks everybody for going through this almost at lunch hour. Well, we don't do these after lunch, right? So the last thing I wanted to talk about is, and this is another thing you can throw in the chat or you can unmute, but looking at future webinars, is that I know the commitment is for us to do monthly webinars. This is the satisfying part for this month. Bianca, I don't know if you want to give a 2-minute spiel on what your August webinar is going to look like. Sorry, putting you on the spot with no notice. Oh, she might have dropped the call. Okay, well, we won't wait for Bianca. And then September, maybe arts and museums, talking about murals and, you know, sort of state specific perspectives on muraling, of which our staff, the building staff, has opinions on muraling and really looking at what building you're putting it on and proper treatments. So I know we're booked up through September, but I would be very interested. Anybody on this call, respond to the email, send me direct emails of future topics you would like addressed. My hope is to get 8 months always in advance, so everybody knows what the queue is looking like 8 months ahead. That way we can do better advertisement. It's not as ramshackle as this one today. So I appreciate the 27 people that are attending, just to make sure we get good representation. So future webinar ideas, please let me know. Please drop them in the chat. And therein lies the formal presentation. But anybody have any questions for us? Jill Love, the executive director of the Department of Community and Cultural Engagement, she was sad she could not join us today. She was double booked, but she is my boss. She would be the one making the formal appointments to the advisory committee and is a very, very big fan of Main Street. So I have great support all the way through the department head. So therein lies, I will stop talking now, but I appreciate everybody's time today. And I don't know if anybody has any questions. You want to unmute and say something, comment, please. We have a few minutes left in the webinar.
Well, I'll point out that Paul Larson brought up building codes on Main Street coming up, and Amber was kind enough to find that and put the link in the chat. So if you're interested in that, it is in the chat.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm trying to go through the chat now to make sure I didn't ignore anybody. Okay. I hate dead air. So doesn't sound like anybody is struggling to unmute. But I really appreciate everybody's time today. I really look forward to meeting you all in person and to becoming more and more involved in Main Street going forward. And I do personally appreciate everybody's patience while we go through this transition process. So if there's no other comments or questions, I think we can adjourn for the day a little bit early.